In the forgotten valley of Eldermere, time had a sound. It lived in the walls of every house, in the flour dust of every kitchen, in the breath of every sleeping child. A deep, resonant ticking that rose from the old clock tower at the heart of the village, steady as a heartbeat, old as the valley itself. Tick, tick, tick. No one knew who had built the tower. The oldest residents could only say it had always been there, rising above every rooftop like a stone finger pointing at the sky. Its bronze clock face bore no numbers, only two long hands that swept in endless circles. The mechanisms never rusted. The gears never jammed. Generation after generation, it simply continued. The villagers called it the constant. They trusted it the way they trusted the sun. That trust died on a Tuesday. Old Martha, the village baker, woke at her usual hour, 4 a.m, guided by habit and the distant rhythm that always pulled her from sleep. But that morning, she woke to nothing. She lay still for a long moment, certain she was mistaken. The ticking had been there every morning of her 63 years. It had been there the morning her mother died, the morning she married, the morning the great flood came and went. It could not simply be absent. She pressed her ear to the cold plaster wall. Silence answered her. Martha pulled her shawl tight and stepped outside. The pre-dawn air smelled of river mud and early frost. The lane was empty. Fog sat heavy in the low places. She looked up and found the tower's hands frozen, both pointing straight upward, locked at exactly midnight. By the time the sun rose, the whole village had gathered in the square, staring up in a hushed unease. No one jostled, no one laughed. Even the children sensed, without understanding, that something was badly wrong. 3 days later, a clockmaker named Theodore Grimm arrived from the capital. He was the best in the country, a thin, precise man with oil-stained fingers and a reputation for fixing what others had given up on. He spent an entire day inside the tower and emerged in the blue hour of early evening, when the sky had turned the color of a bruise. The mayor was waiting. Theodore set his bag down slowly and told him that the machinery was flawless. Every gear, every spring, every mechanism he could test was in perfect working order. The mayor asked why it had stopped. Theodore looked back at the tower for a long moment and said quietly that was precisely what frightened him. The first signs appeared the following night. Emma Fletcher, 10 years old, gap-toothed, fond of climbing things she shouldn't, went to sleep in her narrow bed and woke up 2 years older. Not metaphorically, not in some poetic sense. Her hands were bigger, her feet had outgrown her shoes. When she looked in her mother's mirror, a 12-year-old girl stared back at her, pale and wide-eyed and terrified. Across the village, a fisherman named Robert Hale woke to find his gray hair had turned black. The deep lines carved into his face by decades of weather had smoothed away. His shoulders no longer ached. He felt 20 years younger, because by every measure that mattered he was. A newborn who had been 3 weeks old the night before was now walking. An elderly weaver found herself middle-aged, with no memory of the missing years, only a disorienting sense that time had lurched sideways. Panic moved through Eldermere like a second plague. Theodore barely slept. He haunted the tower by day and the town archives by night, digging through records that went back centuries, tax ledgers, land surveys, parish notes, anything that might hold an answer. He found what he was looking for on the 5th night, behind a loose stone in the archive's lowest room. It was a journal, leather-bound, cracked with age, the cover stained with something dark that Theodore preferred not to examine. The date inside read 412 years earlier. The author's name was written in a cramped, urgent hand. Elias Thorne, scholar, witness. Theodore carried the journal to the nearest lamp and began to read. The early entries were careful and academic. Thorn described a powerful sorcerer named Morvain, who had, in the early years of Eldermere's founding, discovered a means of manipulating the flow of time itself. At first, the power had seemed like a gift. Morvain reversed injuries. He extended harvests. He pulled dying children back from the edge. The valley flourished under his guardianship, and the people built him a fine house on the hill and left offerings at his door. But the entries grew darker as the pages turned. Thorn wrote that power had a particular corruption, that it did not arrive all at once, but seeped in slowly. Morvain had begun selling years. The wealthy paid fortunes to grow younger. The poor, with nothing to offer but time, were taxed in the only currency he now valued. There were old men in their 30s, young women with white hair, children born already tired. Thorn noted that the valley was still beautiful, and that this was the worst of it. That from the hillside it looked exactly as it always had, but that if you looked closely at the faces, you would see the theft in everyone. An alliance of mages had finally moved against him. They could not kill him. His power had grown too deep, threaded through the valley's own soil. But they could contain it. They built a prison from stone and bronze and a century's worth of collaborative magic, and they disguised it as something ordinary. The clock tower. The constant ticking was not mechanical. It was the sound of binding. The final entry in the journal was not Thorn's usual careful script. It was rushed and jagged, the letters crowding into each other as though written in haste or fear. Thorn warned that if the clock ever stopped, the binding would weaken, time would fracture, and Morvain would wake. He wrote that they had been unable to destroy him, and that he prayed for whoever would have to face him next. Theodore closed the journal. From outside, somewhere in the darkness, a sound began. Not laughter exactly, but something that had forgotten what laughter was supposed to feel like. He ran to the mayor's house and hammered on the door until lights appeared. By midnight, the council had assembled in the parlor, and Theodore read them the relevant passages. When he finished, the room was silent for a long moment. One counselor said flatly that they were being asked to believe a sorcerer had been trapped inside their clock tower for 400 years and was now waking up. Theodore confirmed that this was exactly what he feared. Outside, the laughter came again, low, resonant, rising from the ground itself. The window rattled. Then the crack appeared. They heard it before they saw it, a sound like a cannon fired from deep underground, a concussive boom that shook the crystal in the cabinet and dropped dust from the rafters. They rushed outside to find a jagged fissure running from the tower's base to its midpoint, glowing at the edges with a cold, golden light that had no warmth in it at all. Theodore told them that they needed help, and that they needed it now. Thorn's journal had mentioned that the bloodlines of the mages who built the prison had not died out, only retreated. There was a reference to a place called the Glass Peaks, and to a monastery carved into crystal cliffs above the snowline. Theodore left at dawn. He had not intended to bring company, but Emma Fletcher was waiting at the village gate, her 2 large boots laced tight and a pack on her shoulders. Theodore told her she wasn't coming. Emma replied with the particular patience of someone who had already argued this with themselves and won. She pointed out that time was broken, that it was broken specifically on her, and that she therefore had every reason to be there. Theodore looked at her for a long moment, found no good argument against her logic, and said nothing further on the matter. They left together as the sun came up behind the tower, its golden light doing nothing to warm the village below. The journey east was not the kind that travelers wrote songs about. Time had fractured far beyond Eldermere. They passed a forest that was visibly aging, bark cracking, ancient trees splitting and rotting in the span of hours, saplings shooting up only to collapse into mulch. They followed a river for a full day before realizing it was flowing backward, reversing weeks of its own course. In a village 3 days east, They found people who could not hold a moment. They would blink and be somewhere else in their own lives, forward or back, helpless as leaves in a current. Emma held Theodore's sleeve tighter after that. The city of Veyron appeared on the 7th day, half covered in a fog that the locals said had arrived without warning and seemed to belong to a different season entirely. In its great library, the archives of Eternus, 7 stories tall and smelling of old vellum and burnt oak, they searched until their eyes ached. Eventually, they found what they needed in a genealogical register. The mage's descendants still existed, living in isolation above the snow line at the glass peaks. A name appeared beside the entry, Seraphine, with a note advising that she refused all correspondence and was not to be approached. They approached anyway. The climb was brutal. Blizzards hit without warning. At one point, an avalanche crossed their path close enough that they felt the wind of it. Theodore's hands went numb and stayed that way. Emma stopped complaining about the cold after the 2nd day and simply endured it, which Theodore found far more worrying. The monastery, when they finally reached it, was exactly where the register had said it wouldn't be.
Seraphine was old in a way that had stopped counting, with silver eyes that caught the lamplight as though they were generating it rather than reflecting it. She met them at the gate as if she had been expecting them for some time, and told them plainly that she already knew why they had come. She brought them inside, to a room with a fire, and listened without interrupting while Theodore told her everything. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time before saying that they had always known the binding wasn't permanent, minus that nothing held by belief ever truly was. Emma asked whether the prison could be restored. Seraphine hesitated before saying that it could, but that someone would first have to enter the tower and reach the heart mechanism minus a great pendulum at the tower's core. She explained that it had to be restarted by hand, by a person who chose freely to be there. Theodore asked, what would happen to that person afterward? Seraphine looked into the fire. She said that the prison would reform around them minus that they would become part of the mechanism and would keep it running forever. She called it a stewardship rather than a sacrifice, and acknowledged quietly that she understood if that distinction offered little comfort. They returned to Eldermere 3 weeks later to find that the village they had left no longer existed in any recognizable form. Buildings cycled through construction and decay in hours, their timbers green and rotting and rebuilding in a nauseating loop. People moved through the square, in flickers minus young, old, young again, stuttering through their own lives at random. Children wailed in confusion. Dogs cowered under porches, whining at things no one else could see, and the tower blazed. Gold light poured from every crack, of which there were now dozens minus spiderweb fractures running the full height of the stone. The laughter that came from it was continuous, and it had stopped sounding like a voice. It sounded like time itself breaking apart at the seams. Seraphine stood in the square and looked at the tower for a long moment without speaking. Then she turned to the crowd that had gathered around them, minus uncertain, afraid, desperate minus, and told them that there was a way, but that someone would have to choose to stay. The silence that followed was vast. Then Emma stepped forward and said she would do it. A sound moved through the crowd minus not quite a gasp. Something more pained than that. Theodore said no, his voice very controlled. Emma said quietly that she was one person, and that everyone else was suffering. Theodore told her she was 10 years old. She said she was 12 minus, and though she smiled when she said it, her eyes didn't. Before Theodore could find words for what he was feeling, someone else stepped forward. Martha. The baker. Flour-dusted apron, gray braid. The same calm expression she wore when explaining something to someone who should have already understood it. She said simply that she had had her years. Emma started to protest. Martha told her, in a voice that was quiet and absolutely certain that Emma had not, and that this was the point. A moment passed. Then a farmer stepped out from the crowd, then a fisherman, then the schoolteacher, then a woman carrying a child on her hip who somehow managed to step forward anyway, then more. Then dozens. Seraphine stood very still. She murmured to Theodore that this had never been part of the ritual minus that in 400 years. She had never seen anything like it. Something shifted in her silver eyes, and she said that she believed it meant something was now possible that hadn't been before. She worked through the night, rewriting what could be rewritten. The old ritual had assumed one keeper minus a single soul to anchor the mechanism for eternity. But magic, Seraphine explained as she worked, was ultimately about what people were willing to give. When an entire community stepped forward together, the terms changed. It would not require their lives. It would not require one life, or even many. It would require their memories minus shared ones. The kind that made a village rather than simply a collection of buildings. They walked out into full mourning. The chaos was gone. The buildings were themselves again, old and solid and ordinary. The river moved in the right direction. The forest on the hill was just a forest. People stood in the square in their correct ages, blinking in the clean sunlight, looking at their own hands as if verifying a fact. The tower ticked. Steadily, tick, tick, tick. The constant, restored. But there was a cost. Theodore noticed it first when he tried to remember his wedding day and found only the shape of it minus the church. The light through the windows, the general feeling of joy. The details were gone, the specific words his wife had said. The particular way she had looked at him. Around him he saw others going still, reaching inward for something, and finding it just beyond grasp. A birthday recalled only as candlelight. A conversation remembered as warmth without the words. A face that belonged to a feeling of home, but would no longer resolve into features. No one wept. That was the strange thing. There was grief, of course there was minus, but beneath it, something steady. The bonds themselves were untouched. Whatever had made those memories matter still remained, embedded in the relationships that held the village together. The memory of love, even without its details, is still love. And high above, inside the ancient stone, the heart mechanism moved in its endless patient rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Keeping faith, keeping time, forever.